So before the attacks on Iran, the US-Israeli attacks on Iran, there was so much conversation around the tariffs and how they were working and rare earth minerals. The negotiations between the US and China seemed to be winning. But just recently, on June 27th, Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo signed a US brokered peace agreement, which saw the US getting access to $2 trillion worth of DRC minerals in exchange for forcing the withdrawal of the Rwandan-backed M23 militias, which I think most people do perceive as actually US-backed. To contrast, Chinese firms were under fire for making a deal in 2008 for 9 billion in minerals in exchange for infrastructure development. Can you help us unpack this? And also, how does this turn of events affect the current negotiations between US and China? Which obviously, as I mentioned before, rare earth minerals play a prominent role.
I don't think it affects them in the immediate, but it has the possibility of changing the dynamics over the next 5 to 10 years, which may not be fast enough for the United States. The simple fact is that China produces about 50 to 60% of all rare earth elements, but it processes about 90%, which is to say that it has a monopoly or a near monopoly. The rare earth elements are, the 17 elements of the lanthanide group, plus a few others. And these are critical in technology, in high tech, and in particular in defense applications of high tech. So China has a monopoly on this. And so what becomes very, very clear to the United States is that if it goes to war with China, it is actually attacking its own supply chain. It is literally cutting itself off at the knees. And so in order to do that, it needs to diversify. The problem is that rare earth elements are rare in the sense that they're hard to find in great concentrations. You'll see American pundits say, well, rare earth elements are not rare, you find them everywhere. If you see one of these people, ask them to name 3 rare earth elements. They can't, right? That's how rare they are. They've never heard of them. Unobtainium, etc. They don't even know what they're talking about. So it's the refining which is technologically challenging and also very, very industrial development intense. And that will take the United States 5-10 years to build out, if it's even possible, because Chinese hold most of the patents on that technology. But it is a critical factor in the economic dimension of the global war that is happening right now. To some extent, if we think of new technologies, rare earth elements hold a position that is not dissimilar to oil in terms of necessity for sustainable energies, as well as, the kind of heat resistance, high heat resistance magnets that are necessary, for example, for guidance devices in hypersonic missiles, for example. So they're essential and they cannot be replaced. The US has tried to put China in a technological chokehold by cutting off all chips from it, but chips and technology can be invented, but elements are very, very hard to invent. In fact, it's almost impossible to invent, elements, certainly not the lanthanide group. Nobody's going to invent new lanthanides. And so inside this context, the US has been striving very, very hard to find its own access to rare earth elements. And this recent agreement is one example. And of course, when China does an agreement with Africa, with any of a number of countries, what it does is it tries to develop infrastructure for the country. When it develops infrastructure, that infrastructure becomes that country's own infrastructure. Most of the infrastructural development actually in the global south and Africa is for electricity, which is critical, or for water, or for transportation. All of this development becomes the country's own sovereign property. So it's like you take out a loan for a house, not great, but At the end, when you pay that loan off, that house is your property. Essentially, this is what China is helping the global south do. And then, of course, this is always alleged to be some kind of, ridiculous debt scam, debt trap, etc. But notice that a century, 2 centuries that the West was in Africa, it never developed any infrastructure. The minuscule infrastructure that it developed was purely for extraction. Whereas what China is doing is really trying to build infrastructure for these countries. And one of the things that it's also doing is even as it creates contracts for the mining of certain minerals, it's also sharing the technology for these minerals to be refined and processed in the country as well. And so it's a way of sharing the development capacity in the most important technology and in the most important resource field that will determine the fate of the 21st century. So this is what China is doing and has been doing, whereas the US looks to be working purely from a geostrategic approach, largely based on extractive strategic calculations related to the weaponization of rare earth elements in preparation for war.